You see, there are still faint glimmers of civilization left in this barbaric slaughterhouse that was once known as humanity. Indeed, that's what we provide in our own modest, humble, insignificant... fuck it. Fuck you.
Okay, there we go. All right, sorry about the snafu over there. I just you're tweaking your setup, and then you've got like windows just layered everywhere, and you're trying to get all the spacing right with complicated apps that don't look right unless they're particular framing. Anyway, how's it going, guys? Welcome to the channel. Gonna do the Heidegger thing again, and I just wanted to talk for a second about the music. These guys are called werewolves, and it's so over the top that it's like somebody like wrote an album for me. It's like, Steve, the only thing I care about is making music for you. And then somebody just made this album. Actually, I've only heard 2 songs on the album. But I already know. I already just know. And I'm going to shout out the Wolf and the Melody. Tommy Cosmic. Wolf and the Melody channel. I am a fan of his. He is the only reaction channel that I'm subbed to. I follow a few guys, like I'll jump into like Lost in Vegas and a few other people. If like there's somebody that's like doing a critique of how a guitar is being played or something, I'll do those kind of reaction videos because I want to hear pointers about the axe and about the craft of playing the gooter. Is it a gutter? Are we just do the people that play this instrument say they make music from the gutter? Is that like the joke the elites have pulled on us, that all guitar music is gutter music? And then we have to talk about what the definition of a gutter is. And then we have to talk about whether we want to continue to call ourselves that. Is it worth the effort, or do we change the name of the instrument for the sake of our dignity? These are the things that keep me up at night. Anyway, so anyway, the next song, which you heard a snippet of, because I missed the intro, which I got my new intro, so things are kicking great. Anyway, We Are Better Than You is gonna be the name of the next song after the first half an hour or so. Hold on. You know what? Let me tell you something. Whether I'm smoking or not, I can dry out easy when I'm talking. But it happens so goddamn much that I often think about things like posture. And it makes me kind of happy because I can understand how my posture is nobody's bag. But anyway, so I'm going to shout out his work because we talk to each other. And I offered him to come on, and he's gonna look and see if he can do it. All right. Let me see here. 56. The character of conscience as a call. To any discourse, there belongs that which is talked about in it. In discourse, discourse gives information about something and does so in some definite regard. From what is thus talked about, it draws whatever it is saying as this particular discourse. what is said in the talk as such, in discourse as communication. This becomes accessible to the Dasein with of others, for the most part by way of uttering it in language. In the call of conscience, what is it that is talked about in other words? To what is the appeal made? Manifestly, Dasein itself, this answer is as incontestable as it is indefinite. If the call has so vague a target, then it might at most remain an occasion for Dasein to pay attention to itself. But it is essential to Dasein that along with the disclosedness of its world, it has been disclosed to itself, so that it always understands itself. The call reaches Dasein in this understanding of itself, which it always has, and which is concernful in an everyday, average manner. The call reaches the they-self of concernful being with others. Right there, that's that's effectively it's your empathic nature at heart, right? It's don't mind that thud. That was just something off balance. And so it's like there's a certain level of arrogance that comes with really selfishness is probably kind of the correct word for it, right? We have this negative relationship with selfishness because we don't mean to, because it's just easy and short form, and it's meant to imply other things, right? I think that's a big lesson that I think everybody is learning, right? Ayn Rand maybe had a tremendous amount of a blind spot for things, but the thing that was crazy about her at the time is that this was a woman writing about being an individual, and that's the only thing that really made it seem like anything else. And then many people don't understand, and in an odd way, thus makes the appearances of a patriarchy, because of how we respond to women, is that a woman will stand out among the crowd, right? Because she's got more internal conscience than going with the external, like the wisdom of her peers, right? Namely other women who are, who have to, like there's that part of the feminine nature of creating a space of belonging, which is why there are the jokes about like how there's like the troop of like tens, and then there's like a 3 that hangs out with them, right? We call that the chauvinistic scale, I think. I think that's what it's called. By the way, I'm excited about how I framed myself as a chauvinist, because I can show off my shoulders and my pecs without showing you my tits. Isn't this fantastic? This is how the ladies are supposed to do it. Supposed to do it like this the whole effing time. And because ladies have cleavage, it's nice for us. And this makes good television. I've solved it all. Right? So here we are. This works. It's just like wearing a low-cut dress. All right, are any of my jokes landing? No, probably not, because probably I don't see anybody in chat. I'm definitely live, right? Allegedly, I've got a like and 2 concurrent viewers. That's fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you for concurring. Anyway, okay, so now that I've gone and wasted way too much time on paragraph 2, and to what is one called when one is thus appealed to? The one's own self, not to what Dasein counts for, can do, or concern itself within being with one another publicly, nor to what it has taken hold of, set about, or let itself be carried along with. The sort of Dasein which is understood after the manner of the world, both for others and for itself, gets passed over in this appeal. This is something of which the call to the self takes not the slightest cognizance, and because only the self of the they self gets appealed to and brought to here, the they collapses. But the fact that the call passes over both the they and the manner in which Dasein has been publicly interpreted does not by any means signify that the they is not reached to. Precisely in passing over the they, keen as it is for public repute, the call pushes it into insignificance. Betätungsloskit. But the self which the appeal has robbed of this lodgment and hiding place gets brought to itself by the call. When the they self is appealed to, it gets called to the self. All right, there's an annotation right here. Don't have to read it. But it does not get called to that self which can become for itself an object on which to pass judgment, nor to that self which inertly dissects its inner life with fussy curiosity, nor to that self which one has in mind when one gazes analytically at psychical conditions and what lies behind them. The appeal to the self is the they self does not force it inwards upon itself, so that it can close itself off from the external world. The call passes over everything like this and disperses it, so as to appeal solely to that self which, notwithstanding, is in no other way than being in the world. But how are we to determine what is said in the talk that belongs to this kind of discourse? What does the conscience call to him to whom it appeals? Taken strictly, nothing. The call asserts nothing, gives no information about world events, has nothing to tell. Least of all does it try to set going a soliloquy in the self to which it has appealed. Nothing gets called to zu gerufen, this self, but it has been summoned aufgerufen to itself, that is, to its own most potentiality for being. The tendency of the call is not such as to put up for trial the self to which the appeal is made, but it calls Dasein forth and forward into its own most possibilities as a summons to its own most potentiality for being itself. Let's see, I think I do want to read this annotation. And forgive me if annotation is not the right word. Der Ruf stellt seiner Ruftendenz entsprechend das Eingerufen selbst nicht zu einer Verhandlung, sondern als Aufruf zum eigensten Selbstsein können ist ein Vornach von Rufen des Daseins in sein eigensten Möglichkeiten. The verbs anrufen, aufrufen, and vorrufen can all be used in the legal sense of a summons. Aha! Thus, Heidegger is revealing an element of the spirituality of the game in legalese in Germany at the time of the initial German publishing of this. If it's the original. If he's saying it's the original. Because he said the verbs can also be used in legal... Alright, no, there's no contention about... Okay, yeah, he's providing context that Germans would understand as why he's using those words to make this point, is because it would be understandable in the legalese sense, in which there would definitely be like a high German education situation going on, even during the lead up to the revolution, right? The call dispenses with any kind of utterance. It does not put itself into words at all, yet it remains nothing less than obscure and indefinite. Conscience discourses solely and constantly in the mode of keeping silent. In this way, it not only loses none of its perceptibility, but forces Dasein, which has been appealed to and summoned into the reticence of itself, the fact that what is called in the call has not been formulated in words, does not give the phenomenon the indefiniteness of a mysterious voice, but merely indicates that our understanding of what is called is not to be tied up with an expectation of anything like a communication. Let me double check real quick. I think by context I get the word reticence, but I usually don't use that word in my language. So let me get... Alright, the general definition of reticence is the quality or state of being reticent, or keeping silence, the state of holding one's tongue, refraining to speak. Okay, so it's talking about the usually quiet nature of the conscience. That's what's being meant by that. Okay. The fact that what is called in the call... I'm sorry, I already read all that. Yep. Whoops. Yet what the call discloses is unequivocal, even though it may undergo a different interpretation in the individual Dasein in accordance with its own possibilities of understanding. While the content of the call is seemingly indefinite, the direction it takes is a sure one and is not to be overlooked. The call does not require us to search gropingly for him to whom it appeals, nor does it require any sign by which we can recognize that he is or is not the one who is meant. This is the judgment card in tarot. Because we think about judgment and we're waiting for some existential event. No. All it means is that you've finally heard the message of your angels and you're like, oh, I get it. That's why their hands are, oh, that's why. That's how. That's whatever. It's getting your answer. That's the judgment, right? That's your judgment. You graze in consciousness. and thus attain the world. 20 and then 21, then the world. So if that comes up upside down, your world is going to be Bad News Bears. Anyway. Hold on a sec, one overlooked. The call does not require us to search gropingly. I said that already. Whom is meant. When delusions arise in the conscience, they do so not because the call has committed some oversight, has miscalled. How's that going? 3? Just because that's so tricky, I'm going to read it anyway. Ein sich versehen. Ein sich versehen. It's got the word verse is right in the middle of this word. Sich or sich, verse, and then hen, with a hen at the end. Laying an egg, a verse that lays an egg, a sick verse that lays an egg. Sich verrufen. Sich verrufen is an alternate way of pronouncing that, I suppose. Or pronouncing or spelling it. I'm not sure what they mean by the brackets there. And then das Rufs or des Rufs. It's a hyphenation situation. That's what it is. It's ein sich versehen des Rufs. Oh, okay, that's what it is. He's showing you the one term on the left and then the one term on the right, and then in the middle is the hyphenated term that was created by Heidegger. Excellent. Okay, great. My brain's working. Welcome. Waking up. Grand Rising, USA. All right. But only because the call gets heard in such a way that instead of becoming authentically understood, it gets drawn by the they-self into a soliloquy in which causes get pleaded and it becomes perverted in its tendency to disclose. Hold on a second. Let me get that again. That's important. Okay. So let me go actually all the way back to the top of this sentence here. When delusions arise in the conscience, they do so not because the call has committed some oversight or has miscalled, but only because the call gets heard in such a way that instead of becoming authentically understood, it gets drawn by the they-self into a soliloquy in which causes get pleaded and it becomes perverted in its tendency to disclose. Okay, this is when the collective takes over your common sense. We see this consistently in all toxic subgroups and in the low levels of toxic baseline, which were amped up in 2020. Oh, 2020. Thank you, 2020. No thank you, but thank you. Thank you, no thank you. Anywho. One must keep in mind that when we designate the conscience as a call, this call is an appeal to the they-self in itself. As such an appeal, it summons the self to its potentiality for being itself and thus calls Dasein forth to its possibilities. But we shall not obtain an ontologically adequate interpretation of the conscience until it can be made plain not only who is called by the call, but also who does the calling. How the one to whom the appeal is made is related to the one who calls, and how this relationship must be taken ontologically as a way in which these are interconnected in their being. Now let me tell you something, hearing that right now, which is going to be our cliffhanger. If this motherfucker has figured out a scientific way of psychologically proving to oneself that your spirit guides are real. Scientifically proving to yourself the spiritual principle that your guardian angels, your spirit guides, your daemons, your little gnome spirits that steal your socks in your house. If he figures out where that all is in the call or something, do you understand how much beyond words that is to kind of like comprehend? So that's fun. That's fun. Oh, we're gonna break. Are we? Oh, we're breaking the matrix now, motherfucker. All right. Anywho, where was I? Ah, yes. Now, back to our regularly scheduled shredding. Yeah, that song I just said like, ow. I think I might have found like my entrance music. I think that might be my entrance music for whatever I'm doing, anything I'm doing. My God. All right. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, this band is ridiculous. Like I was looking, I just like, okay, do I know any of these names? I don't think I know these names. I don't know if they're from anything, but they are three people. They are three people. This is a power trio. This is a fucking power trio. That is a beefy ass power trio. I mean, like, I'm sure that like in the studio there's like some guitar doubling going on because that's the business, but still because yeah, I can hear the line of one guitar, and I think that there's like a second guitar like buried in there somewhere. It might just be that they're just doubling it. Like he may be using a doubler pedal. Like I have a doubler pedal for the very direct in, like the new song. Like I'm using a doubler pedal there, and that's why it actually has a little bit more robust. So it gives me the ability to make like a halfway decent sounding like scratch track, and then that's what my new intro is, right? And so I'm gonna be practicing a little bit later today, and gonna work on all that jazz. All right. Anywho, enough about me. Let's get back to madness. 57. Conscience as the call of care. Conscience summoned Dasign's self from its lostness in the they. The self to which the appeal is made remains indefinite and empty in its what. When Dasein interprets itself in terms of that with which it concerns itself, the call passes over what Dasein proximately and for the most part understands itself as, and yet the self has been reached unequivocally and unmistakably. Not only is the call meant for him to whom the appeal is made without regard for persons, but even the call maintains itself in conspicuous indefiniteness. If the caller is asked about its name, status, origin, or repute, it not only refutes to answers, but does not even leave the slightest possibility of one's making it into something with which one can be familiar when one's understanding of Dasein has a worldly orientation. On the other hand, it by no means disguises itself in the call. That which calls the call simply holds itself aloof from any way of becoming well known, and this belongs to its phenomenal character. To let itself be drawn into getting considered and talked about goes against its kind of being. Excuse me. Glad I caught that one. I really hate when I gotta cough on a hot mic. I hate it. The peculiar indefiniteness of the caller and the impossibility of making more definite what this caller is are not just nothing. They are distinctive for it in a positive way. They make known to us that the caller is solely absorbed in summoning us to something that is heard only as such, and furthermore, that it will not let itself be coaxed. But if so, is it not quite appropriate to the phenomenon to leave unmasked the question of what the caller is? Yes, indeed, when it comes to listening to the factical call of conscience in an existential way, but not when it comes to analyzing existentially the facticity of the calling and the existentiality of the hearing. But is it all necessary to keep raising explicitly the question of who does the calling? Is this not answered for Dasein just as unequivocally as the question of to whom the call makes its appeal? Right? This is where all of your ancestor memes come from, Granny, seeing you use her cupboard as an altar, like all this silly shit, right? All that silly shit is going on. Like guardian angels, just complaining to their boss that they gotta watch over you because you're an idiot, right? It's all this shit, right? This is all those memes. This is what Heidegger is getting at the essence of, is the guardian angel meme. In conscience, Dasein calls itself. This understanding of the caller may be more or less awake in the factical hearing of the call. Ontologically, however, it is not enough to answer that Dasein is at the same time both the caller and the one to whom the appeal is made. When Dasein is appealed to, is it not there in a different way from that in which it does the calling? Shall we say that its own most potentiality for being itself functions as the caller? Indeed, the call is precisely something which we ourselves have neither planned nor prepared for, nor voluntarily performed. Not have we ever done so. It calls... Hold on a second. That does not... Yeah. Es. Ruft. Here, the pronoun es is used quite impersonally and does not refer back to the call itself. Der Ruf. Okay. So it's der Ruf versus es Ruft. That seems to be the distinction there. Okay, good to know. And S is or ice, Isa, Isis. It's all those things. Anyway, it calls against our expectations and even against our will. On the other hand, the call undoubtedly does not come from someone else who is with me in the world. The call comes from me and yet from beyond me. Okay, here we go. We're already at 2. Okay, we don't have to read the rest of these. These phenomenal findings are not to be explained away. After all, they have been taken as a starting point for explaining the voice of conscience as an alien power by which Dasein is dominated. If the interpretation continues in this direction, one supplies a possessor for the power thus posited. Or one takes the power itself as a person who makes himself known, namely God. All right. I believe this would be the first instance in which Heidegger has really used the title of God. Title of God. I refuse to say name. It's not a name. Who did God? You don't know who did it. Right? Because if I'm going to say who did it on that level, I'm saying name somebody. Was it Odin? Poseidon? Cupid? Name your fucking deity. You don't have one. This is the problem. You're just anointed. I'm a Christian, I'm running around, I'm anointed. Great, you're anointed. You're an anointed jackass. These phenomenal findings are not to be explained away. After all, they have been taken as a starting point for explaining the voice of conscience as an alien power by which Dasein is dominated. If the interpretation continues in the direction one supplies a possessor for the power thus posited, or one takes the power itself as a person who makes himself known, namely God. On the other hand, one may try to reject this explanation in which the color is taken as an alien manifestation of such a power, and to explain away the conscience biologically at the same time. Both these explanations pass over the phenomenal findings too hastily. Such procedures are facilitated by the unexpressed but ontologically dogmatic guiding thesis that what is, in other words, anything so factual as the call, must be present at hand, and that what does not let itself be objectively demonstrated as present at hand just is not at all. Interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, when the call arises, which is the question, which, it's a phenomenon that's just going to happen. You can lie to the entire world and say a call does not pop up on you. Right? But if it were that easy, then psychopaths wouldn't exist. And psychopaths are the only ones that don't have a conscience. And it is determinably hard to figure it out. And, by and large, it's kind of because there's the narcissistic trait within the psychopath that, primordially speaking, they kind of think that they are God, and they somehow got thrown down onto Earth and entrapped in a world where they need that, where he actually has to be a dependent. It's just like, man, I need everybody to do everything? People just don't give me clothing and food and shelter? Right? And somehow inherently that they stick with that as their primary programming is to be supplied by that. And to put off, and they'll spend money putting up a facade to hold up this lifestyle. And it's really complicated. Thomas Sheridan's Puzzling People is the way to go. And I'm just saying that the point is that you're, every voice in your head, if you're saying that that's your voice as God, then you are absolutely a psychopath. And that's why people started having the argument about whether Jesus said, yeah, no, dude, I'm definitely God, you gotta worship me, or not, right? Because we're trying to have a distinction here between a cult leader. But the problem is that that's the whole fucking game. If Jesus is not capable of lying and he's saying he is not God, then that is about as much the truth as you can possibly fucking ask for. Because, or just be honest that you worship a God of lies, which dishonors him as a man, but unfortunately, that's also incorrect, but you're going to have to read the original Greek gospel to understand why. And because I haven't read it myself yet, and I'm working off of an academic reference point that I'm still working out, I'm not going to absolutely say that's the truth, but I'm pretty fucking convinced right now, and I'm going to hold to that. Because it makes all of these other psychological problems associated with people that take the church seriously. It's quite something. It is quite something. It's something that just happens at the top. And it's weird how it fucking happens. God. Yeah, so we all know what the problems I'm talking about are here, right? So, This is why this is incredibly important, right? Because if the person's looking at the call as the voice of God, and then they either think they are themselves God, and that's why the voice is there for them, or that they think they're a prophet, or they think they're being tormented by the devil. Or maybe they think they are the devil. And of course, what's fun if you're the devil is that you can say that you are God. So what did Jesus say, folks? But methodologically, this is to precipitate. We must instead hold fast not only to the phenomenal finding that I receive the call as coming both from me and from beyond me, but also to the implication that this phenomenon is here, delineated ontologically as a phenomenon of Dasein. I read Gooder. Only the existential constitution of this entity can afford us a clue for interpreting the kind of being of the it which does the calling. Does our previous analysis of Dasein's state of being show us a way of making ontologically intelligible the kind of being which belongs to the caller, and along with it, that which belongs to the calling? The fact that the call is not something which is explicitly performed by me, but that, rather, it does the calling. Oh, I love how it's it in quotation marks. It immediately makes me think of Pennywise if we're talking about psychopaths here. Anyway, does not justify seeking the caller in some entity with a character other than that of Dasein. Yet, every Dasein always exists factically. It is not a free-floating self-projection, but its character is determined by the thrownness as a fact of the entity which it is, and as so determined it has, in each case, already been delivered over to existence, and it constantly so remains. Dasein's facticity, however, is essentially distinct from the factuality of something present at hand. What I would even go as so far to say with that statement is that Dasein is our facticity in the blend of the facticity of existence that is out there amongst everybody, right? Because the way he puts it here, perhaps in the next statement, he's going to talk about the alleviation of the stress, right? Because here you can go divergent on this thought, and you can get demiurgic right away, right? With this whole sense of the struggle, because what gives you freedom is that the world gets off your fucking back, right? Dasein is, you are in a state of happiness as a Dasein when the world gets off your fucking back, when the world stops plucking away at your fucking belief system, right? This is why it fits very important to the heart, your heart and soul, because your heart and soul's got a stake in your sense of cosmology. That if you're a flat earther or you're a round earther, you just can't talk about it, right? For you, it's an acceptable religion. It's you've groomed yourself to it. You've bound yourself in the fasciae of it, right? You have an appeal to the solidarity of the authenticity and authority of the record of the data and the interpretation of the data. That is your scripture for how you have bound and groomed your beliefs together on any side of the fucking argument. And my Asclepian principle has to root that out. So that way people that really fucking are good for one another can stop being toxic to each other. For fuck's sake. Existent Dasein does not encounter itself as something present at hand within the world, but neither does thrownness adhere to Dasein as an inaccessible characteristic, which is of no importance for its existence. As something thrown, Dasein has been thrown into existence. It exists as an entity which has to be as it is, and is it, and as it can be. That is factically, may be obscure and hidden as regards the why of it, but that it is has itself been disclosed to Dasein. What we got here? Hang on. Okay, don't have to read either one. The thrownness of this entity belongs to the disclosedness of the there, and reveals itself constantly in its current state of mind. This state of mind brings Dasein more or less explicitly and authentically face to face with the fact that it is, and that it has to be something with a potentiality for being as the entity which it is. For the most part, however, its mood is such that its thrownness gets closed off in the face of its thrownness. Dasein flees to the relief which comes with the supposed freedom of the they-self. This fleeing has been described as a fleeing in the face of the uncanniness, which is basically determinative for individualized being in the world. Uncanniness reveals itself authentically in the basic state of mind of anxiety, and as the most elemental way in which thrownness Dasein is disclosed, it puts Dasein's being in the world face to face with the nothing of the world. In the face of this nothing, Dasein is anxious with anxiety about its own most potentiality for being. What if this Dasein, which finds itself sich befindet in the very depths of its uncanniness, should be the caller of the call of conscience? Nothing speaks against this, but all those phenomena which we have hitherto set forth in characterizing the call and its calling speak for it. In its who, the caller is definable in a worldly way by nothing at all. The caller is Dasein in its uncanniness, primordial, thrown being in the world as the not at home, the bear that it is. In the nothing of the world, the caller is unfamiliar to the everyday they-ness. It is something like an alien voice. What could be more alien to the they, lost in the manifold world of its concern? Then the self, which has been individualized down to itself in uncanniness and been thrown into the nothing, it calls even though it gives the concernfully curious ear nothing to hear, which might be passed along in further retelling and talked about in public. But what is Dasein even to report from the uncanniness of its thrown being? What else remains for it than its own potentiality for being as revealed in anxiety? How else is it to call than by summoning Dasein towards this potentiality for being, which alone is the issue? The call does not report events. It calls without uttering anything. The call discourses in the uncanny mode of keeping silent, and it does this only because in calling the one to whom the appeal is made, it does not call him into the public idle talk of the they, but calls him back from this into the reticence of his existence, potentiality for being. When the caller reaches him to whom the appeal is made, it does so with a cold assurance, which is uncanny but by no means obvious, wherein lies the basis for this assurance, if not in the fact that when Dasein has been individualized down to itself in its uncanniness, it is for itself something that simply cannot be mistaken for anything else. Right? Right. This is about getting down to the singularity, right? Because why are we here? We are here because we segued at the very end, brought up the issue of the conscience at the end of death, right? And so it's that was known because of how far we could take the question of death, right? And what we primordially break ourselves down to in the microcosm, which we can tell by anybody who, within their deepest, sincerest emotions, knew, like they were certain, absolutely beyond certain, that this snap of a moment was going to kill them. And what was the most important value that their nervous system reacted to that experience to, right? It's just like that's quite the level. And so I went over all of that shit and explained quite a few things that I was able to ascertain from my brushings with death, right? And believe me, you haven't lived unless you've brushed with death, right? And you have to have a higher sense of your fate. Not your faith, but your fate. Have a higher sense of your fate, right? You've got these 3 Norns here. How do they help you? One is trying to tell you where the origin, the root of the issue is. Another one is trying to tell you what's more important than what. And then the other one is just trying to give you good advice. And she's usually much older. It's very simple. It's very simple. What is it that so radically deprives Dasein of the possibility of misunderstanding itself by any sort of alibi and failing to recognize itself, if not the forsakenness, the Verlassenheit, with which it has been abandoned, the Überlassenheit to itself? So I just mentioned the Norns, right? Like, knowing that the natural human man who is not a psychopath has this particular relationship that has an archetypal manifestation under certain universal moments that we all understand. Like, life and death situations are going to constrict you down to the most primordial voice of your Norns, telling you how you got into this mess, how bad the mess is, and what you're going to have to do to get out of the mess. Boom, boom, boom. That's it. That's what it means to call upon the Stygian witches. All right? You can ignore them, and then they're going to yell at you because they don't want you to die. Or you could talk to them all the time because they're happy to help. As long as you're not abusing the situation. Anyway. Uncanniness is the basic kind of being in the world, even though in an everyday way it has been covered up. Out of the depths of this kind of being, Dasein itself, as conscience, calls. The "it calls me," es ruft mich, is a distinctive kind of discourse for Dasein. The call whose mood has been attuned by anxiety is what makes it possible, first and foremost, for Dasein to project itself upon its own most potentiality for being. The call of conscience, existentially understood, makes known for the first time what we have hitherto merely contended. The uncanniness pursues Dasein and is a threat to the lostness in which it has forgotten itself. Hang on a second, because I want to take a break soon. How much further? Okay. Quite a bit, it looks like. Yeah, that's quite a bit. Okay. All right. We're gonna take a break right here. 1 second. Okay. So now, from this point further, I have no idea what this band sounds like. So all the better to eat you with. Oh, these guys are like old school Cataclysm. Like, they go hard like Serenity in Fire by Cataclysm. Oh. Anyway. Goddamn. QSB, what's up? What's up, dude? Quite Sparky Bear. Alright, where are we at? Okay, the proposition that Dasein is, at the same time, both the caller and the one to whom the appeal is made, has now lost its empty formal character and its obviousness. Conscience manifests itself as the call of care. The caller is Dasein, which in its thrownness, in its being already in, is anxious. Let's see. Okay. Sic angst. The older editions have sic angstend, which has virtually the same meaning and is more characteristic of Heidegger's style. About its potentiality for being. Okay, so hold on a second. Dasein, which in its thrownness, in its being already in, is anxious about its potentiality for being. The one to whom the appeal is made is this very same Dasein, summoned to its own most potentiality for being, ahead of itself. Dasein is falling into the they, in being already alongside the world of its concern, and it is summoned out of this falling by the appeal, the call of conscience, that is, conscience itself has its ontological possibility in the fact that Dasein, in the very basis of its being, is care. So, we need not resort to powers with a character other than that of Dasein. Indeed, recourse to these is so far from clarifying the uncanniness of the call that instead it annihilates it. In the end, does not reason why explanation of the conscience have gone off the track lie in the fact that we have not looked long enough to establish our phenomenal findings as to the call, and that Dasein has been presupposed as having some kind of ontological definiteness or indefiniteness, whichever it may chance. Why should we look to alien powers for information before we have made sure that in starting our analysis we have not given too low an assessment of Dasein's being regarding it as an innocuous subject endowed with personal conscience, somehow or other occurring? Right? So what this is doing now at this point is that Heidegger is looking for like this super scientific way to figure out, the soul, right? Because this is like, it wouldn't shock me because we're like 50 something in, right? There's like 80, 90 or 100 or something of these. There's quite a bit more to go. If he is not getting to the soul over here, or at least knowing the difference between you being the soul, and that perhaps the soul is usually just along for the ride, and it's just that seems like not the way I want to stop being here, right? That's it's this kind of thing, right? It's like it's you, but you treat it outside of you or whatever, right? Like, if you guys understand how my shit works with my three selves meditation, the tripartite soul system, the heart center there, that's your inner deity, if you will, right? That's the pure and innocent, sees the best in the world child you, right? It's just like everybody's all tripping up about like the Baby Yoda TV show, with the Mandalorian, right? Because, everybody wants their based superhero, right? It's just like, yeah, he's like a dad figure thing, and he doesn't have to be like a lady at all. Right? And no, he shouldn't have to be like a lady at all. I agree. Yeah. But of course, that's just one particular I don't want to say diluted. But like that's one like pure essential side of what's good about this, right? And of course, when you frame it a certain way, it sounds like it's excluding a bunch of other things. It's excluding some things because it's making a point of being exceptional. And so you have to ask yourself, the question is, how exceptional is your conscience? And yet, if the caller, who is nobody, when seen after the manner of the world, is interpreted as a power, this seems to be a dispassionate recognition of something that one can come across objectively. When seen correctly, however, this interpretation is only a fleeing in the face of the conscience, a way for Dasein to escape by slinking away from that thin wall by which the they is separated, as it were, from the uncanniness of its being. This interpretation of the conscience passes itself off as recognizing the call in the sense of a voice which is universally binding and which speaks in a way that is not just subjective. Furthermore, the universal conscience becomes exalted to the world conscience, which still has the phenomenal character of an it and nobody, yet which speaks there in the individual subject as the indefinite something. But this public conscience, what else is it than the voice of the they? A world conscience is a dubious fabrication, and Dasein can come to this only because conscience, in its basis and its essence, is in each case mine, not only in the sense that in each case the appeal is to one's own most potentiality for being, but because the call comes from that entity which in each case I myself am. And you know, like, remember, if your conscience gives you that jerk to be like, watch it, you're going to fall off the cliff, because here it is, it's like your dog and you're on the fool card, right? That's like, you know, like, Loki is good and bad luck, right? And like I've said a dozen times, there are two sides to Loki, and then there's also either an imposter of Loki, or Loki himself has been corrupted, which is the more likely case scenario because of the complex intertwining of the weave in which Loki is a force for. He is the eternal chaotic force, making conscious choices, as Jotuns have consciousness. You know, certain conscious choices to trip you or to save you. To put poison in front of your plate or purity. Right? He does all these different things. And our blind spot is fair game for him to do either. And for a long time, that was well understood and under control until some external force brought in corruption. And that's what the Eddas are trying to say with the Aesir-Vanir War. Because somebody ignored their conscience, convinced a whole other people to ignore their consciousnesses, and now created some artificial beef, right? Because that's the lesson of it, right? It's like a bitch rode into town with gold, got everybody hooked on gold, like getting everybody all screwed up by the commerce and the bad energy that was being held by who that gold was from. These events, I think, are before Odin has Draupnir. I think Draupnir is established after this war, right? So, which is why, probably Draupnir is the thing that stops there from being Golveg. I think that's what that ring means, right? It's just like, I think it's spiritual. I think that's what it is. You know, Odin and Tyr in the summer gets that fucking ring. Let me explain to you, because he rules Asgard with Odin seasonally, much like the Fae courts. It's one thing about them that's extremely like Fae courts, that they're seasonal. We have the winter Fae court, and the summer Fey court. That's Tyr and the summer Fey court. Okay? So they hold the integrity of gold, so that way it doesn't become a petty thing that we slit our throats about. And then through control, right? Instead of there being a gold flood to devalue it, it drips. And with patience, you can accumulate quite a bit of wealth. And it's very much largely a symbol of banking investment knowledge. Like this Mercury, right? You know, like the Romans are fucking right about Odin, right? Mercury, Shiva, it's all that good jazz. With this interpretation of the caller, which is purely in accord with the phenomenal character of the calling, the power of conscience is not diminished and rendered merely subjective. On the contrary, only in this way do the inexorability and unequivocal character of the call become free. This interpretation does justice to the objectivity of the appeal for the first time by leaving it its subjectivity, which of course denies the they-self its dominion. Nevertheless, the interpretation of the conscience as the call of care will be countered by the question of whether any interpretation of the conscience can stand up if it removes itself so far from the natural experience. How is the conscience to function as that which summons us to our own most potentiality for being, when proximally, and for the most part, it merely warns and reproves? Does the conscience speak in so indefinite and empty a manner about our potentiality for being? Does it not rather speak definitely and concretely in relation to failures and omissions which have already befallen or which we still have before us? Does the alleged appeal stem from a bad conscience or from a good one? Does the conscience give us anything positive at all? Does it not function rather in just a critical fashion? Just considerations are indisputably within their right. We can, however, demand that in any interpretation of conscience, one should recognize in it the phenomenon in question as it is experienced in an everyday manner. But satisfying this requirement does not mean in turn that the ordinary ontical way of understanding conscience must be recognized as the first court of appeal. Erst instance. For an ontological interpretation, on the other hand, the considerations which we have just marshaled remain premature as long as the analysis of conscience to which they pertain falls short of its goal. Hitherto, we have merely tried to trace back conscience as a phenomenon of Dasein to the ontological constitution of that entity. This has served to prepare us for the task of making the conscience intelligible as an attestation of Dasein's own most potentiality for being, an attestation which lies in Dasein itself. But what the conscience attests becomes completely definite only when we have delimited plainly enough the character of the hearing which genuinely corresponds to the calling. The authentic understanding which follows the call is not a mere addition which attaches itself to the phenomenon of conscience by a process which may or may not be forthcoming. Only from an understanding of the appeal, and together with such an understanding does the full experience of conscience let itself be grasped. If in each case the caller and he to whom the appeal is made are at the same time one's own Dasein themselves, then in any failure to hear the call or any incorrect hearing of oneself, there lies a definite kind of Dasein's being. A free-floating call from which nothing ensues is an impossible fiction when seen existentially. With regard to Dasein, that nothing ensues signifies something positive. So then, only by analyzing the way the appeal is understood can one be led to discuss explicitly what the call gives us to understand. But only with our foregoing general ontological characterization of the conscience does it become possible to conceive existentially the conscience's call of guilty. All experiences and interpretations of the conscience are at one in that they make the voice of the conscience speak somehow of guilt. And they had the squeeze an annotation at the top of the page, so hold on. Das im gewissen Gerufen schuldig existential zu begriffen. As Heidegger's will points out, the word schuldig, schuld, and their derivatives have many different meanings, corresponding not only to indebtedness, as we have seen. Yes. Skuld or should, the witch, the Jotun, the Norn, as I said. She's the one that's, like giving you advice, like I said, the older one. But also to guilt and responsibility. In the present chapter, we shall translate them by guilty and guilt, whenever possible, even though these expressions will not always be entirely appropriate. Okay, well understood. Okay, so we've reached the end of 57. So here we are at 58. Let me highlight that, which is page 325. All right, let's see. One moment, please. Okay, so we're at 58, right? Yep, and then 59 is 335. So that's about 10 pages. That's not bad. Okay, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to do one more. All right, and then I'm going to reset my page properly. All right, this gem is called, hold on, Crushing Heaven's Mandate, which that's got a very, like, I want to say we're going for Slayer over here.
I am the god of death!
Yeah. There's no quit. There's no quit with this drummer. He's got that Monomarth. It's like a Monomarth's drummer. Got like Nathan Explosion on vocals, and then like the rest is just kind of like that. That's like what it is. That's what this band is. I just feel like I'm listening to like Death Clock and a Monomarth and a collaboration that's just over the top. That's what I'm listening to. Anyway, this is not a new album. This came out in June of 2022. Why did nobody throw this at me? My God, I don't have enough metalhead friends in my life. I rely on the algorithm, and the algorithm's not being cool to bands. All right, I'll be honest. I also was like narrowing my musical acumen for a little while because I just needed to focus and just wanted to have familiar music for a little bit. We all go through an I need no new music phase. All of us go through that. '58. Understanding the appeal and guilt. To grasp phenomenally what one hears in understanding the appeal, we must go back to the appeal anew. The appeal to the they self signifies summoning one's own most self to its potentiality for being, and of course as Dasein, that is, as concernful, being in the world and being with others. Thus is interpreting existentially that towards which the call summons us, we cannot seek to delimit any concrete single possibility of existence as long as we correctly understand the methodological possibilities and tasks which such an interpretation implies. That which can be established and which seeks to be established is not what gets called in and to each particular Dasein from an existential standpoint, but is rather what belongs to the existential condition for the possibility of its factical existential possibility for being. Okay. Do I want to read that? Yes, I do. Nicht das je existential im jeweilige Dasein in dies gegriffen kann und will fixiert werden, sondern das, was zur existenziellen Bedingung der Möglichkeit des je faktisch existenziellen Sankönnens gehört. In the older editions, we find an dieses rather than dieses, and zur appears in spaced type. When the call is understood with an existential kind of hearing, such understanding is more authentic. The more non-relationally Dasein hears and understands its own being appealed to, and the less the meaning of the call gets perverted by what one says or by what is fitting and accepted. Was sich gehört und gilt, but what is it that is essentially implied when the appeal is understood authentically? What is it that has been essentially given us to understand in the call at any particular time, even if factically it has not always been understood? We have already answered this question. However, in our thesis that the call says nothing which might be talked about, gives no information about events, the call points forward to Dasein's potentiality for being, and it does this as a call which comes from uncanniness. Now remember, he's not saying a call towards life. He's talking about the call towards potentiality for being, right? Some can say that when somebody wishes to end their own life, right, something happens where the call steps out of the way, or you have blocked out the call, if that's possible, and then you jump off the cliff, or you pull the trigger, or you whatever, right? And then it's and one could say that it's possible to I'd say that it's not possible to ignore the call unless you're working under MK Ultra or you're a psychopath. Because the call is very different than like the base kind of reptilian survival mechanism. The call can have some heart in front of it, right? Like, if you know, like your hero complex can take over when you see something that you love and or care about, and it's in danger, and you put yourself in front of the danger. And you say, no, I will take all the danger. Right? And you have no time to think. You just have to get hit by a train, and your life just has to end because there was a small child, and everything in your conscience said, do it. Right? You know that you have to be in a certain, you have to be really in a certain place, and I think we all know there's a lot of Christians out there that are in that place, right? That's what gets really hard when with the path outside of that, right? It's just like you look for an in-group because you gotta feel the reassurance around you, right? That, you know, you're where you belong, and it's the right place for you to belong in your soul as a soul. To know that you're going to get through here in a way that was in accord with higher purpose, and it depends on the church, you know, how much of your desires are meant to be there in, quote, God's purpose, right? Because most of these churches, they're not saying don't have any desires or whatever. It's just like your son desires to go play baseball. You don't tell him no, right? It's just like your desires is there's just the overcoat of God's plan or whatever, right? Which that's actually a healthy life attitude. In reality, it's why based culture is making a comeback, because there's inspiration there. It's not postmodern depression. But also, you get motherfuckers like me who have a completely different relationship with the Creator, because I have a relationship with all of the various gods. And that shows you also, well, actually, you've got this tremendous level of choice, and you can also do none at all. There's nothing in our codexes that say that it's bad if you don't do something that you feel like makes you belong with or without a certain fucking god. You know, it's just like that's your own business, and honestly, you're not doing anything crazy. Usually, probably because you have good judgment, and the gods are pretty happy, and you're pretty happy, and then life moves on. And then it's just a question of how much do you blame the gods for anything bad that happens. Obviously, right? So anyway, so the potentiality for being the uncanniness. Let's take a look down here. All right. Anyway, So the caller is, to be sure, indefinite, but the whence from which it calls does not remain a matter of indifference for the calling. This whence, the uncanniness of thrown individualization, gets called to, mitgerufen, in the calling, that is, to, gets disclosed, minterschlossen, in calling forth to something. The whence of the calling is the whither, to which we are called back, when the call gives us a potentiality for being to understand. It does not give us one which is ideal and universal. It discloses it as that which has been currently individualized and which belongs to that particular Dasein. We have not fully determined the character of the call as disclosure until we understand it as one which calls us back in the calling us forth, als vorufender rukroth. If we take the call this way and orient ourselves by it, we must first ask what it gives us to understand. But what is not the question of what the call says answered more easily and surely if we simply allude to what we generally hear to fail, to hear in any experience of conscience, namely that the call either addresses Dasein as guilty, or, as in the case when the conscience gives warning, refers to a possible guilty, or affirms as a good conscience, the one is conscious of no guilt. Whatever the ways in which conscience is experienced or interpreted, all our experiences agree on this guilty, if only it were not defined in such wholly different ways, and even if the meaning of this guilty should let itself be taken in a way upon which everyone is agreed, the existential conception of this being guilty would still remain obscure. Yet, if Dasein addresses itself as guilty, whence could it draw its idea of guilt, except from the interpretation of its own being? All the same, the question arises anew: who says we are guilty and what guilt signifies? On the other hand, the idea of guilt is not one which could be thought up arbitrarily and forced upon Dasein. If any understanding of the essence of guilt is possible at all, then this possibility must have been sketched out in Dasein beforehand. How are we to find the trail which can lead to revealing this phenomenon? All ontological investigation of such phenomenon as guilt, conscience, and death must start with what the everyday interpretation of Dasein says about them. Because Dasein has falling as its kind of being, the way Dasein gets interpreted is for the most part inauthentically oriented and does not reach the essence, for to Dasein the primordially appropriate ontological way of formulating questions remains alien. But whenever we see something wrongly, some injunction as to the primordial idea of the phenomenon is revealed along with it, where, however, shall we get our criterion for the primordial existential meaning of the guilty? From the fact that this guilty turns up as a predicate for the I am, is it possible that what is understood as guilt in our inauthentic interpretation lies in Dasein's being as such, and that it does so in such a way that so far as any Dasein factically exists, it is also guilty. Thus, by invoking the guilty, which everyone agrees that he hears, one has not yet answered the question of the existential meaning of what has been called in the call. What has been called must first be conceptualized if we are to understand what the call of guilty means and why and how it becomes perverted in its signification by the everyday way of interpreting it. Interesting. Because talking about guilt is also can be talking about shame. There's a lot of things that can be said about the definition of guilt. Now, let's see if he's about to say some shit that's going to blow my mind. Excuse me. Everyday common sense first takes being guilty in the sense of owing or having something due on account. Okay, let me get this annotation. Okay, we're reading this one. Die eigentlich Verständigkeit nimmt das Schuldigsein, sonst in Sinn von Schulden bei einem etwas an Bretheben, while this represents a very familiar usage of the German Schuldigsein, it of course does not represent a common sense usage of the English, being guilty, which comes from an entirely different stem. One is to give back to the other something to which the latter has a claim, which is the law of Gebo, by the way, right? This being guilty as having debts, Schulden haben, is a way of being with others in the field of concern, as in providing something or bringing it along. Other modes of such concern are depriving, borrowing, withholding, taking, stealing, failing to satisfy, in some way or the other, claims which others have made as to their possessions. This kind of being guilty is related to that with which one can concern oneself. Being guilty also has the signification of being responsible for Schuld sein an, that is, being the cause or author of something, or even being the occasion for something. In this sense of having responsibility for something, one can be guilty of something without owing anything to someone else or coming to owe him. On the other hand, one can owe something to another without being responsible for it oneself. Another person can incur debts with others for me. Let's see. All of that is just German, so there's no context. All right. These ordinary significations of being guilty as having debts to someone and having responsibility for something can go together and define a kind of behavior which we call making oneself responsible. That is, by having the responsibility for having a debt, one may break a law and make oneself punishable. Yet, the requirement which one fails to satisfy need not necessarily be related to anyone's possessions. It can regulate the very manner in which we are with one other publicly, making oneself responsible for breaking a law as we have thus defined it, can indeed also have the character of coming to owe something to others. Let's see here. All right. This does not happen merely through law breaking as such, but rather through my having the responsibility for the others becoming endangered in his existence, led astray, or even ruined. This way of coming to owe something to others is possible without breaking the public law. Thus, the formal conception of being guilty in the sense of having come to owe something to another may be defined as follows: being the basis for a lack of something in the design of an other, and in such a manner that this very being the basis determines itself as lacking in some way in terms of that for which it is the basis. This kind of lacking is a failure to satisfy some requirement which applies to one's existence being with others. Yes, yes, yes. This, you see, this moment that is being described right here, this has been one of my hardest lessons, right? Because I grew up under arrested development, meaning I had dependencies, and I have had bad behavioral habits because of dependency issues. These are things within my shadow that I had to work out personally, and am still working through them. We need not consider how such requirements arise, and in what way their character as requirements and laws must be conceived by reason of their having such a source. In any case, being guilty in the sense last mentioned, the breach of a moral requirement is a kind of being which belongs to Dasein. Of course, this holds good also for being guilty as making oneself punishable and as having debts, and for any having responsibility for. These two are ways in which Dasein behaves. If one takes laden with moral guilt as a quality of Dasein, one has said very little. On the contrary, this only makes it manifest that such a characterization does not suffice for distinguishing ontologically between this kind of attribute of being for Dasein and those other ways of behaving which we have just listed. After all, the concept of moral guilt has been so little clarified ontologically that when the idea of deserving punishment or even of having debts to someone has also been included in this concept, or when these ideas have been employed in the very defining of it, such interpretations of this phenomenon could become prevalent and have remained so. But there, with the guilty gets thrust aside into the domain of concern in the sense of reckoning up claim and balancing them off. Give me a second here. How far down are we? Still a couple of pages here, aren't we? I said it was 10 pages, right? There's 289. And then we're right here at 283. Oh, okay. Got it. All right. The phenomenon of guilt. We're probably going to take one more intermission. The phenomenon of guilt, which is not necessarily related to having debts and law breaking, can be clarified only if we first inquire in principle into Dasein's being guilty. In other words, if we conceive the idea of guilty in terms of Dasein's kind of being. If this is our goal, the idea of guilty must be sufficiently formalized to those ordinary phenomenon of guilt which are related to our concernful being with others will drop out. The idea of guilt must not only be raised above the domain of that concern in which we reckon things up, but it must also be detached from the relationship to any law or ought, such that by failing to comply with it, one loads himself with guilt. For here too, guilt is still necessarily defined as a lack, when something which ought to be and which can be is missing. Hold on. Okay, there's no English there. To be missing, however, means not being present at hand. A lack as the not being present at hand of something which ought to be is a definite sort of being which goes with the present at hand, in the sense it is essential that in existence there can be nothing lacking, not because it would then be perfect, but because its character of being remains distinct from any presence at hand. Nevertheless, in the idea of guilty, there lies the character of the not in the guilty, is something that can definitely apply to existence. Then this raises the ontological problem of clarifying existentially the character of this not as a not. Moreover, to the idea of guilty belongs what is expressed without further differentiation in the conception of guilt as having responsibility for, that is, as being the basis for. Hence, we define the formally existential idea of the guilt as being the basis for a being which has been defined by the not, which lies in the concept of, guilty as the basis, being the basis for a being which has been defined by a not, that is to say, as being the basis of nullity. Nullity, okay. Okay, we're going to read this one. Grundsein für ein durch ein nicht bestimmtes Sein, das heißt Grundsein einer Nichtigkeit. The noun Nichtigkeit, which might well be translated here as notness, may be used in legal context where something has been declared null and void, and can be used more generally to apply to almost anything that is vacuous, trifling, ephemeral, or nil. Heidegger will rule out some of these connotations on H285. All right, so in short, this is that nervous system reaction of design, right? Like, say you're in court, right? And, you know, this is the release of the clutches of guilt, is when you're found not guilty by the jury, and then you can let go, and you can cry, and all this nonsense, right? So anyway, the idea of the not, which lies in the concept of guilt as understood existentially, excludes relatedness to anything present at hand which is possible or which may have been required. Furthermore, Dasein is altogether incommensurable with anything present at hand or generally accepted, geltend, which is not it itself, or which is not in the way Dasein, namely existing. So any possibility that, with regard to being the basis for a lack, the entity which is itself such a basis might be reckoned up as lacking in some manner, is a possibility which drops out if a lack, such as failure to fulfill some requirement, has been caused in a manner characteristic of Dasein. We cannot simply reckon back to there being something lacking, Mangelhaftigkeit, in the cause. Being the basis for something need not have the same not character as the privativum, which is based upon it and which arises from it. The basis need not acquire a nullity of its own from that for which it is the basis. Seinem begründeten. This implies, however, that being guilty does not first result from an indebtedness, a Verschlussung, but that, on the contrary, indebtedness becomes possible only on the basis of a primordial being guilty. Can something like this be exhibited in Dasein's being, and how is it at all possible existentially? And that is the question in which I am going to bring us to the last break, because this is the last passage. All right. Here we go. Oh, this one is going to be called Harvest of the Skulls. Just, yeah. Man, yeah, they're definitely just gunning to be just the nastiest and violentest. Oh, but man, they go through some nasty like they got like a lot of they keep it interesting. The change ups on the riffs are really hit you nice. This is fun. This is good for me. This is good for me. This is a not for everybody. It's a not for every metalhead metal album. Yeah, it's a particular kind of. It's definitely in the core, like the more core-ish, like deathcore or whatever they want to call it. My God. And don't mind me, I'm snacking a little bit. I've got pretzels and honey, but yeah, it's just gonna sit there. I'm gonna have more when I'm done. But anyway, let's get back on it. Dasign's being is care. It comprises in itself facticity or thrownness, existence, projection, and falling as being. Dasein is something that has been thrown. It has been brought into its there, but not of its own accord. As being, it has taken the definite form of a potentiality for being, which has heard itself and has devoted itself to itself, but not as itself. Oh boy. Sein ist als sein können bestimmt, das sich selbst gehört und doch nicht als es selbst sich zu eigen gegeben hat. It is perhaps tempting to interpret gehört as coming from the verb gehören, belong, rather than hören, which is to hear. We could then read belongs to itself rather than has heard itself. Our version, however, seems to be favored by the grammar of this passage. Aha! Important moment in linguistics. We have detected a German pun. That is called a pun. And that is where you find the deep truth. So that is the kind of word that would have popped up in German comedy. Can you hear the voices in your head? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Anyway. As existent, it never comes back behind its thrownness in such a way that it might first release this, that it is and has to be from its being itself, and lead it into the there thrownness. However, not lie behind it as some events which has happened to Dasein, which has factually befallen and fallen loose from Dasein again. Hang on. Okay. On the contrary, as long as Dasein as care is constantly it's that it is, to the entity it has been delivered over, and as such it can exist solely as the entity which it is. And as this entity to which it has been thus delivered over, it is in its existing the basis for its potentiality for being. Although it has not laid that basis itself, it reposes in the weight of it, which is made manifest to it as a burden by Dasein's mood. And how is Dasein this thrown basis? Only that it projects itself upon possibilities into which it has been thrown. The self, which as such has to lay the basis for itself, can never get that basis into its power, and as yet, as existing, it must take over being a basis. To be its own thrown basis is the potentiality for being, which is the issue for care. In being a basis, that is, in existing as thrown, Dasein constantly lags behind its possibilities. It is never existent before its basis, but only from it and as this basis. Thus, being a basis means never to have power over one's own most being from the ground up. This is not belongs to the existential meaning of thrownness. It itself, being a basis, is a nullity of itself. Hang on. nullity. Let's see. Es ist nicht existent vor seinem Grund, sondern je nur aus ihm und als dieser Grundsein besagt demnach des eigensten Seins von Grund auf machtig sein, dieses nicht gehört zum existenziellen Sinn der Geworfenheit. Grundsinn ist er selbst eine Nichtigkeit seiner selbst, presumably the not to which Heidegger refers in this puzzling passage is implied in the never of the preceding sentence. Nullity does not signify anything like not being present at hand or not subsisting. That one has in view here is rather a not, which is constituted for this being of Dasein, its thrownness. The character of this as a not, may be defined existentially in being itself. Dasein is as a self, the entity that has been thrown. It has been released from its basis, not throwing itself, but to itself, so as to be as this basis. Dasein is not itself the basis for its being, inasmuch as this basis first arises from its own projection. Rather, as being itself, it is being of its basis. All right, we don't have to read that one. This basis is never anything but the basis for an entity whose being has to take over being a basis. Dasein is its basis existentially. That is, in such a manner that it understands itself in terms of possibilities, and so understanding itself is that entity which has been thrown. But this implies that in having a potentiality for being, it always stands in one possibility or another. It constantly is not other possibilities, and it has viewed these in its existential projection. Not only is the projection as one that has been thrown determined by the nullity of being a basis, as projection, it is itself essentially null. This does not mean that it has the ontical properties of inconsequentiality or worthlessness. What we have here is rather something existentially constitutive for the structure of the being of projection. The nullity we have in mind belongs to Dasein's being free for its existential possibilities. Freedom, however, is only in the choice of one possibility. That is, in tolerating one's not having chosen the others and one's not being able to choose them. In the structure of thrownness, as in that of projection, there lies essentially a nullity. This nullity is the basis for the possibility of inauthentic Dasein in its falling. And as falling, every inauthentic Dasein factically is, care itself in its very essence, is permeated with nullity through and through. Thus care, Dasein's being, means as thrown projection, being the basis of a nullity, and this being the basis is itself null. This means that Dasein as such is guilty. If our formerly existential definition of guilt as being the basis of a nullity is indeed correct, existentially, nullity has by no means the character of a privation, where something is lacking in comparison with an ideal which has been set up but does not get attained in Dasein. Rather, the being of the entity is already null as projection, and it is null in advance of any of the things which it can project and which it mostly attains. Hang on. The negative character to which Heidegger here calls attention is not brought out as clearly by the word projection, etymologically throwing forward, as it is by the German entwerfen, throwing off or throwing away, where the prefix ent indicates separation. Okay, gotcha. So it's more about you pitching off, right? Your projection in that particular sense. This nullity, moreover, is thus not something which emerges in Dasein occasionally, attaching itself to it as an obscure quality which Dasein might eliminate if it made sufficient progress. In spite of this, the ontological meaning of the notness, the Nichtheit of this existential nullity is still obscure. But this holds also for the ontological essence of the not in general. Ontology and logic, to be sure, have exacted a great deal from the not, and have thus made its possibilities visible in a piecemeal fashion, but it itself has not been unveiled ontologically. Ontology came across the not and made use of it, but is it so obvious that every not signifies something negative in the sense of a lack? Is its positivity exhausted by the fact that it constitutes passing over something? Why does all dialectic take refuge in negation, though it cannot provide dialectical grounds for this sort of thing itself, or even just establish it as a problem? Has anyone ever made a problem of the ontological source of notness, or prior to that, even sought the mere conditions on the basis of which the problem of the not and its notness and the possibility of that notness can be raised? And how else are these conditions to be found except by taking the meaning of being in general as a theme and clarifying it? The concept of privation and lack, which moreover are not very transparent, are already insufficient for the ontological interpretation of a phenomenon of guilt, though if we take them formally enough, we can put them to considerable use. Least of all, we can come any closer to the existential phenomenon of guilt by taking our orientation from the idea of evil, the malum, as privatio boni, just as the bonum and its privatio have the same ontological origins in the ontology of the present at hand. This ontology also applies to the idea of value, which has been abstracted from these. And once again, what was I saying about value earlier? This is the other norn. This is verdandi, right? This is the norn of worth, right? Like, a lot of people probably aren't listening to all three of their norns. They're probably just jumping straight to should. What should I do? Not really thinking too much about where it came from most of the time. Anyway. Not only can entities whose being is care load themselves with factical guilt, but they are guilty in the very basis of their being, and this being guilty is what provides, above all, the ontological condition of Dasein's ability to come to owe anything in factically existing. The existential being guilty is equiprimordially the existential condition for the possibility of the morally good and for that of the morally evil. That is, for morality in general and for the possible forms which this may take factically. The primordial being guilty cannot be defined by morality, since morality already presupposes it for itself. Exactly. It's like saying proving the Bible is true by referencing the Bible. But what kind of experience speaks for this primordial being guilty, which belongs to Dasein? Nor may we forget the counter question. Is guilt there only if a consciousness of guilt gets awakened? Or does not the primordial being guilty make itself known rather in the very fact that guilt is asleep? Being guilty. Schuldigsein, in the earlier editions, the sign is emphasized by having the type spaced out. Make itself known rather in the very fact that guilt is asleep, that this primordial being guilty remains proximally and for the most part undisclosed, and that it is kept closed off by Dasein's falling. Being reveals only the aforesaid nullity. Being guilty is more primordial than any knowledge about it, and only because Dasein is guilty in the basis of its being and closes itself off from itself as something thrown and falling. Is conscience possible, if indeed the call gives us this being guilty as something which at bottom we are to understand? The call is the call of care. Being guilty constitutes the being to which we give the name of care. The uncanniness Dasein stands together with itself primordially. Uncanniness brings this entity face to face with its undisguised nullity, which belongs to the possibility of its own most potentiality for being. This is why the dark night of the soul in the hero's journey is so important, because it brings you to this point yourself. To the extent that for Dasein as care, its being is an issue, it summons itself as a they, which is factically falling, and summons itself from its uncanniness towards its potentiality for being. We follow the newer editions in reading. Ruft es aus der Umlichkeit sich selbst as faktisch verfallendes man auf zu seinem Sein hin. This is apparently a correction of the older version where one finds man selbst instead of man, and might be tempted to construe this as a misprint for man selbst, the they self. Yeah, okay. So, see, that's interesting. See, those are interesting translation problems that takes work to catch that, and then to let you know, as part of their integrity, their authenticity, hey, listen, here's how we rationalize this to let you know that we didn't make this very popular mistake. Because once again, we're talking about puns and the deeper primordial truth of a pun. All right, so that was for one, right? Where are we at? Okay. The appeal calls back by calling forth. Oh, and here we are already. All right, I don't have to read the rest of those. Hold on a second, just checking here. I think I got 2 pages. Yeah, excellent. All right, we're almost done. Perfect. It calls Dasein forth to the possibility of taking over in existing, even that known entity which it is. It calls Dasein back to its thrownness, so as to understand this thrownness as the null basis which it has to take up it into existence. This calling back, in which conscience calls forth, gives Dasein to understand that Dasein itself, the null basis for its null projection, standing in the possibility of its being, is to bring itself back to itself from its lostness in the they, and this means that it is guilty. But in that case, the sort of thing which Dasein gives itself to understand would be information about itself, and the hearing which corresponds to such a call would be a taking cognizance of the fact that one is guilty, right? You see, you have to understand, like, the reason why we're living in a world of such madness, right, is because there are literally people that surround and reinforce the Dasein of one guilty person, and this is politics, right? This is the president with their whole campaign team surrounding them, making all the apologies for what the president's cabinet did or whatever, right? It's this nonsense. Anyway. If, however, the call is to have the character of a summons, does not this way of interpreting the conscience lead to a complete perversion of its function? Does not a summons of being guilty mean a summons to evil? Let me put it to you this way. What did Hillary Clinton say at this point? What difference does it make? Right? Which, regardless of her personal issues with all of her cohorts pretending to grill her, she loses her nerve and forgets that she's just playing a part and that these are her friends and they're trying to fuck over America together. And so instead she showed her ass and said, like, listen, don't show your ass like that. You can't be president of the United States if you show your ass. But that's exactly what she did. The meaning of the call becomes plain if, in our understanding of it, we stick to the existential sense of being guilty. So what I'm saying in short is that, you know, there's a whole bunch of people that have been trying to defend this delusional world that that someone like her is like one of the chosen delegates for, right? You know, to serve the world this way, in this level of disservice. So anyway, instead of making basic the derivative conception of guilt in the sense of an indebtedness which has arisen through some deed done or left undone, such a demand is not arbitrary. If the call of conscience comes from Dasein itself, is directed towards that entity alone, but if so, the summons to being guilty signifies a calling forth to that potentiality for being, which in each case I, as Dasein, am ready. Dasein needs not first load a guilt upon itself through its failures or omissions. It must only be guilty authentically, guilty in the way in which it is. Hearing the appeal correctly is thus tantamount to having an understanding of one's own most potentiality for being, that is, to project oneself upon one's own most authentic potentiality for becoming guilty. Yeah, isn't that interesting, the way we think about how we could become guilty of something? You know, how we fantasize about a change of our world in that particular way. So what do we got here? Oh, this is a big, long one. Schuldig werden können. This own most authentic sense of schuldig werden is presumably to be contrasted with the sense to which we have called attention in notes 2 and 4 and 327 and 282 above, which we have expressed by the phrase come to O. When it seems to us that Heidegger has the authentic sense in mind, we shall express it by the phrase becoming guilty, though this device exaggerates a contrast which would not be felt so sharply by the German reader. When Dasein understandingly lets itself be called forth to this possibility, this includes its becoming free for the call, its readiness for the potentiality of getting appealed to, and understanding the call, Dasein is in thrall to Hurig, its own most possibility of existence. It has chosen self. In so choosing, Dasein makes possible its own most being guilty, which remains closed off from the they-self. The common sense of the they knows only the satisfying of manipulable rules and public norms and the failure to satisfy them. It reckons up infractions of them and tries to balance them off. It has slunk away from its own most being guilty so as to be able to talk more loudly about making mistakes. But in the appeal, the they-self gets called to angerufen, the ownmost being guilty of the self. Understanding the call is choosing, but it is not a choosing of conscience, which as such cannot be chosen. What is chosen is having a conscience, as being free for one's ownmost being guilty. Understanding the appeal means wanting to have a conscience. This does not mean that one wants to have a good conscience, still less that one cultivates the call voluntarily. It means solely that one is ready to be appealed to. Wanting to have a conscience is just as far from seeking out one's factical indebtedness as it is from the tendency to liberation from guilt in the sense of the essential guilty. Wanting to have a conscience is rather the most primordial existential presupposition for the possibility of factically coming to owe something. Excuse me a moment. I'm really just sitting here, and I really just have to have a little bit more of this nonsense. Just a little bit. Taking a momentary break for honey. It's very drippy honey, so it's very easy to make a mess. All right, where was I? Understanding the call of the signs almost self, take action itself. It says, I think I'm over here, right? Wanting to have a conscience is rather the most primordial existential presupposition. No, I read that, right? Towards it, the ones wanting to have a conscience become taking over of that essential consciousness. No, I didn't read that. Yeah. All right, hang on. All right. Okay. Bear with me while I go black screen for a moment, and let's get back at it. Factically, however, any taking action is necessarily a conscious-less, not only because it may fail to avoid some factical moral indebtedness, but because on the null basis of its null projection it has, in being with others, already become guilty towards them. This will be going back off again in a minute, too. Thus, one's wanting to have conscience becomes the taking over of that existential consciousness, within which alone the existential possibility of being good subsists. Right? And this gets into... This is kind of like moral relativism, so I may want to be divergent of Heidegger here, but let's hear how he goes, right? Because I don't want to be a moral relativist. A solipsist, if you will. So, through the call, though the call gives no information, it is not merely critical, it is positive in that it discloses Dasein's most primordial potentiality for being as being guilty. Thus, conscience infests itself as an attestation which belongs to Dasein's being, an attestation in which conscience calls Dasein itself face to face with its own most potentiality for being. Is there an existentially more concrete way of determining the character of the authentic potentiality for being, which has thus been attested? But now that we are exhibited a potentiality for being, which is attested in Dasein itself, a preliminary question arises. Can we claim sufficient evidential weight for the way we have exhibited this, as long as the embarrassment for our imprinting the conscience in a one-sided manner by tracing it back to Dasein's constitution while hastily passing over all the familiar findings of the ordinary interpretation of conscience is one that is still undiminished? Is then the phenomenon of conscience as it actually is still recognizable at all in the interpretation we have given? Have we not been all too sure of ourselves in the ingenuousness with which we have deduced an idea of the conscience from Dasein's state of being? The final step of our interpretation of the conscience is the existential delimitation of the authentic potentiality for being which conscience attests, if we are to assume ourselves of a way of access which will make such a step possible, even for the ordinary understanding of the conscience, we must explicitly demonstrate the connection between the results of our ontological analysis and the everyday ways in which the conscience is experienced. All right. Boom shakalaka. All right, we finally got through it all. Great. How's it going, guys? So, Quite Sparky was the only person who participated in chat. I don't know how many viewers I had altogether. I guess 18 views. But at any rate, thank you so much for tuning in. I don't think I got anything more to say about Heidegger tonight. This has been all awesome. I will catch you guys later.